there are already H2020, Horizon 2020 program for 2018, where it's possible already start applying to that. And the last I forgot that European Commission is committed not only to European islands, but really to help islands around the world, especially European islands, of course, from Caribbean, but also to Asian islands.
That was my second part of my question. Yes. Is there opportunities for people in this room to avail of European money, which is always good. So I think maybe should grab Gianni over coffee break and ask him how to prize some money out of the European Union. So
yes, I did do an announcement because next year there will be the Greedy Islands, there will be Greedy Islands Europe, but I'm planning to have regional Asia-Pacific Greedy Islands events that I will try to bring European Commission people and also a lot of stakeholders. Anyway, we are planning to do it in the Philippines.
Excellent, Gianni. Thank you very much. So we'll move quickly on, a change of speed. I'd like to welcome Attorney Francis Antonio C. Jun to the conference. There's a slight change to Attorney Francis's title. He's actually here under the title of COO of the Transmission Committee of the Philippine Electricity Market Corporation. Reading Attorney Francis's comments in his bio, two things that jumped out at me, Francis, was you are the walking dictionary of electrical regulation and you are the articulate voice of the ERC. So there are two phrases that really captured my imagination, and really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. There was, an air of gloomy optimism yesterday in the room. So, I'm just looking forward to what you're going to discuss today, and the title is The Right to Self-Generate. So please join me in welcoming Attorney Francis.
Hello, good morning. The organizers may have been so used to already calling me the Executive Director of the Energy Regulatory Commission, and that's why they still thought that I'm still connected with the Commission. But right now, I am a Senior Consultant Advisor to Senator Win Gatchalian, the Chairman of the Committee on Energy in the Philippine Senate. And at the same time, I am part of the Transition Committee of the Philippine Electricity Market Corporation, or PEMC. PEMC is the market operator of our wholesale electricity spot market. So I suggested this topic, the right to self-generate and self-consume. And I was first introduced to this topic by a friend when we were discussing the barriers to entry of more renewable power given the current legal and regulatory framework in the country. In my old job with the ERC, I was witness to how difficult it was to implement the incentive mechanisms provided for in the law. I was part of the technical working group at ERC that worked on the feed-in tariff rules. We worked on that for several years until it was finally implemented. We also worked on the net metering. So I am familiar with the various issues raised by various stakeholders for or against the implementation of these incentive mechanisms. But then, being a lawyer, I was intrigued by the possibilities that can come to light by the simple expedient of the state adopting a policy to support and enhance the right to self-generate, and the regulator aligning its regulations to such policy. It can in fact be transformative of the current structure of the electric industry, something that anyway is already happening. So my friend and I found ourselves one day discussing over lunch how issues relating to this right to self-generate have been taking shape in the US, where some states are proposing legislation to require self-gen customers to sell all their generation to their utilities. In other states, utilities set up more barriers to interconnection of self-gen and propose other creative rate-making designs to make it more expensive for self-gen customers to source part of their requirements from their own generation. And so since that discussion, I have put together a wish list of protections and guarantees that should emanate from the right to self-generation, which can perhaps be legislated, not just to give them teeth, but to altogether overcome the existing and future challenges and barriers to the entry of more renewable power and cheaper options to electricity users in this fast-changing electricity sector. So I'm wearing the hat now of being the advisor to the senator. Some of you may know Nonoy Oplas, a staunch defender of coal. He is a columnist in the newspaper, and in his August 25, 2016 column in a leading newspaper, he declared, "Private property and its protection is among the cornerstones of a free society. It bestows upon the individuals, households, and enterprises exclusive rights. What to do with their private property like a car or a piece of land. Use it, sell it, rent it out, or donate it. As an economic concept, property is a mass of things or objects useful to human activity and which are necessary to life, for which reason they may in one way or another be organized and distributed, but always for the use of man. Inherent in the ownership of property are the bundle of rights, among them the right to possess to the exclusion of others, the right to use and enjoy and appropriate the fruits thereof, and the right to dispose. Facilities used to generate electricity are susceptible of appropriation. There is no dispute that they are property within the definition and requisites of law. They have a use and they satisfy a human need. The right of ownership over the same is duly recognized. In Philippine law, ownership over generation facilities, including those generation for self-consumption, is recognized. That is why the regulator imposes or issues a COC, or a certificate of compliance, on their owners. As such, to the owners of generation facilities belong such rights, including the rights to use and enjoy their fruits, and in the case of self-generation facilities, the right to self-generation and consumption, including the right to store for future use, and the right to dispose to others any excess generation. For hundreds of years, the complexities and costs associated with mechanisms or systems to generate and transmit electricity for industrial and end-use applications led to the creation of highly centralized and commercialized power industries, and to the dependence of individuals and communities on monopoly franchises and service territories that were formed to provide such service. There became an exclusive right of a utility to a franchise within an area to charge and receive payment from its array of customers in exchange of its investments on infrastructure and related systems. The combination of rights, obligations, and compensation is also known as the regulatory compact, or cost of service rate regulation. This has been the ongoing arrangement for our electricity transactions for the longest time that we can remember. This structure has in fact been enshrined in the law when it restructured the electric power industry in the Philippines into generation, transmission, distribution, and supply. As of late, technological and economic advances are putting pressure on the traditional electricity industry setup, with the actual cost of electricity production via solar PV systems, and other new and storage technologies swiftly attaining parity with the retail cost of a utility, we are seeing the Philippine electricity industry evolving. We are seeing the installations of net metering systems quickly picking up. Even the number of those disqualified by the 100 kilowatt net metering threshold under the Philippine law is increasing, mainly by commercial users for their own consumption. We hear also about solar applications in off-grids, including hybrids, and in unviable areas through microgrids. With storage and even blockchain technology now getting into the equation, who knows what will happen to the current commercial and legal arrangement in the power industry. The transformation, although inevitable, will not be easy. In the US and other countries, for example, self-generation advocates have experienced the effort of utilities to set up barriers to discourage the deployment of commercial and residential RE systems. The opposition may take the form of the utilities delaying interconnection or prohibiting third-party providers or owners of small PV systems from selling to individual consumers or from selling into the grid. It can involve efforts to dissuade self-generation by imposing steep wheeling charges on the bills of such customers or demand that the full output of their self-generating systems be fed into the utilities grid. I believe that the right to self-generate is a natural extension of our fundamental right as persons. But for this right to be fully protected, I believe that there is urgency to adapt to the changing needs and objectives of the electricity consuming public and Philippine society, promote and encourage the development of new energy systems that are responsive to new technologies, align regulatory framework to address such new technologies impacting the industry, and establish a legal framework to protect and uphold the rights of electricity consumers and the general public amidst such changes. As I mentioned at the outset, there are protections and guarantees I have listed, and I will argue that they should be part of any discussion of the right to self-generate. 1. Anyone has the right to generate and consume electricity to reduce their use of electricity that is obtained from the grid using energy systems that they can own or lease from third-party installers or providers. This includes the right to use such technology to store such generated energy. 2. They should be allowed to connect their energy systems that generate or store energy to the electricity meter provided by the utility, in accordance with the requirements of the regulator, of course, to ensure safety, compliance to all building, fire, electrical, environmental, grid codes, as well as other regulatory issuances. The regulator must ensure that they are connected in a timely and least costly manner. And for this purpose, the regulator shall regulate the fees imposed by the utilities for the conduct of the required impact or facility studies and other charges for processing net metering or interconnection applications by self-gen customers. 3. Regardless of the size or capacity of their energy systems, they are entitled to a fair and reasonable remuneration or credit from their utility under a net metering or similar arrangement, or at their option, they should be allowed to sell or assign such exported energy to another customer of the utility or to an aggregator, subject to payment of wheeling and other applicable charges to the utility as may be set or regulated by the regulator. 4. They shall remain within the existing customer class to which they should belong in the absence of a net metering or system that generates energy or stores energy, and shall not be subject to any fees or charges that are different from the fees and charges assessed to customers of the same rate class, and this is to avoid discrimination. And fifth, if the area where they are located is not served by the utility having a franchise over the same, they shall have the right, subject to such regulations that the regulator shall promulgate, to put up their own microgrid system to distribute the excess energy generated to those connected to such system. The construction and operation of such microgrid system should not be considered a utility operation requiring a legislative franchise and a derogation of the franchise right of the existing utility. These are the list of rights and guarantees and protections that I believe should form part of any recognition of the right to self-generate. But this is a work in progress. The list can go on. In the meantime, I leave you with these two key points. One, policymakers and stakeholders must begin to enter into sensible dialogues to weigh in on the advantages and challenges associated with the advancement of the right to self-generate. And two, our institutions, particularly the regulator, must be responsive to the changing times and review, revise, and promulgate regulations as and when they are needed to protect and promote our right to self-generate. Thank you and good morning.
There's hurdles that the regulation will have a place to play, but is there fundamental technical rules that are stopping people?
Well, if we look at the experience under the implementation of net metering program, I think there's a limitation in terms of the capacity of the utilities, especially the electric cooperatives. I understand that there's a lot of complaints by solar companies as regards the inability of these utilities to process net metering applications, maybe for lack of the competence, the technical competence by the staff of these utilities to be able to process these applications and see to it that the technical standards as provided for under the net metering rules are met by the applicants. So I think that is one. There's also the complaints received usually that it takes a lot of efforts to, say, apply under the net metering program. We have a lot of rules and requirements. Aside from those imposed by the regulator pursuant to the net metering rules, you have also the local government requirements, which is a different animal altogether, but it's a complaint. If there can only be harmonization in terms of the requirements, perhaps there can only just be one body or entity that will see to it that the technical requirements for interconnection are satisfied by the applicant.
Thanks very much. Any additional question? Yeah, we have one down the back, Coco, at the door.
I didn't catch it in your presentation that the off-grid sector is part of the proposition for the right to self-generate. Primarily because right now, with the installation of solar home systems, the people in the remote areas are already self-generating. And also, in those areas, the regulators are not so much reaching their oversight powers in those areas. Am I correct in my understanding that what I'm trying to drive at is that in the remote areas where rural electrification has to accelerate, there is more liberal treatment of the right to self-generate. And therefore, this regulatory reach is weaker in those areas, and I think, can that not be expanded, or are we just basically, does the right to self-generate restricted only in on-grid areas where the tendency of the regulators is really to control and manage bigger grids?
My thesis is that the right to self-generate inheres in every person.
Correct.
So if you're in an off-grid area, that right follows you. So there is no discrimination in between grid and off-grid. Unlike, well, say, in the Renewable Energy Act of the Philippines, where, say, the net metering program was made just applicable to the off-grid, to the grid, where in fact that same program can benefit those in the off-grid. But my idea is for there to be a recognition of the right to self-generate. And from this recognition should follow certain rights and protections that will be given to one that will own these facilities.
So I take it that since you're working in the office of the chairman of the Senate Committee on Energy, that the amendment on the Magna Carta of electricity consumers will now be amended to include this right to self-generate?
The Magna Carta is a regulation by ERC, so it has not attained the status of law. What we need is a law that will come from Congress. Yes, we are trying to put together a proposal. Of course, the journey towards realization is long, but with the support of the stakeholders, perhaps we can push this agenda forward.
Thank you.
Thank you for that discussion. We actually have a text question. Again, Attorney, just a quick question that came through. What is the rationale of making net metering installation at homes so hard? What can the government do potentially to simplify the approval process? Sorry, I didn't have to read it.
Well, there's no standardized procedure for each utility. They would have different level of competence to handle the applications. So like those that have been used to already processing, like Meralco, I guess over time, the period of application has been shortened. But of course, it's also dependent on how fast the local permits can be secured. And again, there's no uniformity as far as the requirements of our local government units, and so that also causes delay. What can government do? There have been proposals. There have been proposals for streamlining the permitting process. There's one pending in the Senate, also authored by Senator Gatchalian, to address this. But I guess more efforts have to be exerted to be able to address the issue on the delays caused by the local governments, and also the competence of the utilities to handle the net metering application.
Any further questions? Yeah.
Hi, good morning. From your presentation just now, it seems like at this moment there is no regulatory framework that allows or that protect anyone from the right to self-generate. So, if please correct me if I understand it wrongly. But in this scenario, without any regulatory framework at this moment, what would be the implication for people that is trying to install solar systems for their own consumption to reduce their electricity consumption from the utility grid? Thank you.
Well, there is recognition of the right, but it's not clear when the boundary of that right versus the right of the franchised utility, for example, versus the right of the public as far as public safety, etc. So I think because the industry is evolving, there is a need to have a legal framework that is flexible and with the policies already just enshrined and the details of implementation calibrated and filled in by the regulator, which can from time to time revise, issue, promulgate regulations depending on the needs of the sector.
And one final question here.
Okay, good morning. This is Ruth Brianis, Green Energy Solutions. My question is, Attorney Francis, is the right to generate also follows the right to distribute? This is the real question. NEA law, the provision on the National Electrification Administration, supervise the electric cooperatives. And under the functions of electric cooperatives, they have the right and authority and the power to generate their own power to be distributed to their consumers in their jurisdiction. Under the CSP rule, competitive selection process, if I generate the power as a cooperative, will the power I generate be subjected to CSP? It's an issue which is really, we want to know, especially when it comes to, there is no CSP rule in connection with renewable energy projects. So thank you, I'll be happy to know the answer.
Well, that is why my idea is that there has to be a law. Since this will be a law passed after previous laws, there can be implied repeals or clarifications of previous laws. Second, there will be no distribution as we defined it in our law. There will be no distribution here. Distribution can be handled by the utilities because they have the franchise, they have the obligation, in fact, to provide that service. What we're saying is if you have self-generation facilities, you have the right to the fruits, to the generation of your facilities. But if you have excess, what will you do with the excess? You have the right to interconnect. So when you have excess over your consumption, you inject it to the grid. Right now, if you're under net metering, you are somewhat compensated for your property. If you're 100 kilowatts above, you self-generate, you have excess, you inject to the grid, you don't get anything. Is there violation of your right to the fruits of your property? I would think so, because there is unlawful taking, in effect. Your fruits are being used by someone else without you being remunerated. Perhaps, if there can be a guarantee in the law, we're not talking here right now of utility scale generation that would require, say, CSP. We're not talking here right now of how much the payment for that excess generation will be. The regulation can address those as they manifest these issues. But right now, we're proceeding from the traditional setup. Well, since I think the 1930s, we have that Commonwealth Act. That is still our law in terms of the utility regulation of distribution utilities. We have the EPIRA enshrined in 2001, but still the setup is the traditional generation, transmission, distribution, supply. But what I presented is, and what has been discussed yesterday and earlier, that there are changes happening. Solar, storage, we have all these that actually already empower us to generate for our own. But if we will not have that protection, we will not have the incentive to really own what we can really already own under our law.
Last question. How long will the law be passed? I know I'm a lawyer. You know, how long will that law be passed? Because are we waiting for 3 years, 5 years? Because you know I could generate power, the power that I will distribute. The question is, okay, I am a co-op. I generate the power that is needed for my consumers, exclusive in my jurisdiction. Will that power I generate be subjected to CSP?
Well, one, I'm not talking here of the co-op already generating for its own requirement as a utility supplier to its captive customer. I'm talking here of the end-use customer having the facilities to generate for its own. So I guess it's a different matter altogether if we require a CSP, say for the purchases, if it will be the DU purchasing the excess power, this can be questions like at what rate will that be covered by the CSP requirement? But these are already implementation details. But first we have to settle because, like you mentioned earlier, the co-op, the utility, it has the right, it has the franchise right to supply its customers, and so it cannot be impinged upon. But look what's happening now. Isn't it that there is already the generation, not just by the utility for its customers, but also by the end-use customers exporting under the net metering?
I think this is an intriguing conversation.